If you grew up in the 80s, you probably had one of these around. This is the NES Zapper. It came with mini versions of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and was especially well known for the Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt combo cartridge that was also with a lot of those systems. It's kind of this plain gray color that makes it look a lot like something that came straight out of a low-budget 80s sci-fi movie. Apparently Nintendo of America thought that it looked a little too much like a real gun still, because they later on re-released it with the whole case redone in a bright orange color to make it even more obvious that it's supposed to be a toy. But if you had grown up in Japan, you would have had one of these instead. This is the Famicom equivalent of the NES Zapper. It was basically just called the Gun, or Gun. It was released as part of the Kosenju series, the light ray gun or light beam gun series. I think I've seen this thing called the beam gun in English sources, so that's good a name as any. Nintendo had been making little toy light guns in that same series all through the 70s, just standalone toy type things, so it was something they had experience with, and it probably made sense for them to integrate it with their new Famicom system when they released that. There were a handful of Famicom games released that worked with it. They all had this bright purple casing on the cartridge, because Famicom cartridges all had these bright colored cartridges, and Nintendo seemed to go with the convention of purple to indicate light gun games for whatever reason. I believe all of the light gun games did indeed make it to the US as well. I don't think most of them became quite so well known as Duck Hunt did, but anyway. I just happen to have one of these that I need to clean up and make sure it works and everything, so since there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of information on the internet, English-speaking or otherwise, about the Famicom light gun, beam gun thing, I figured there would be some value in going ahead and recording a video doing that and documenting what it looks like inside and how one might go about cleaning and fixing these things if one had to. So, here is the Famicom beam gun laid out on a mat for disassembly. I have already had this apart. I got it as part of a big box of Famicom games, and it was listed as not working. It was indeed not working when I first plugged it in. All I had to do when I took it apart was do some cleaning on some internal metal contacts, and it seems to be working fine now, so at this point all I'm going to do is take it apart again, separate out some of these plastic bits, and give them a good clean. I'm not sure if it's too visible on the lighting here, but it looks like there's a fair amount of dust and smudges on it, so I think that a little bit of cleaning will probably be good for it and make it look a little better. I didn't mention this previously, but it does use this 15-pin Famicom extension connector. It does not use the standard 7-pin NES connector, so you can't use this directly into a American NES or vice versa without quite a bit of clever rewiring. Another thing you'll see on the case here is that it does have this stamp listing the model number. If I can get it to focus, HVC005, I think. The other side does have the Nintendo logo with the date. One thing I think I've seen on a forum thread somewhere is someone had one of these that looked almost exactly like this, and they weren't sure if it was genuine or not, but it did not have those little logos on it, so I'm pretty sure that was a knockoff, so those may exist somewhere out there. As far as I know, this is the genuine Nintendo product. The screws on it are pretty much identical, I think, to the way the screws on the US Zapper are. I think they're even the same screws, a lot of them. But there's a number of screws on the side here. These are just regular-sized Phillips screws. You just need a regular screwdriver for those. There are a couple of little ones over here. There's one on the top of the barrel there, and there's another one recessed down in here that's a little easy to miss. Those are actually some kind of slightly smaller screw, and I'm not really sure what they're doing with the head on them or what kind of screwdriver they expect you to use. They kind of have this circular indentation on the middle and then a horizontal slash across them, but for my purposes, just using a small flathead is plenty good for those. There's all the screws. I think they're all identical between the two sizes, so you don't need to worry about mixing them up too badly. There's one more down here that I'll pull out when I take this apart in a moment. But they do look a little bit rusty or corroded or something to me, so I may try to clean those up with something or other later on. Especially the little ones with the weird head. I think the head is kind of wearing away a little bit. That might make it be making it a little harder for the flathead to grip than it necessarily should. Just for comparison, here's the Nintendo Zapper. You can kind of barely see in there the screws, but I guess the two on the barrel are a lot more visible here. But these are actually a bright silvery color. As far as I know, not particularly tarnished. You can also see a little better view of maybe what that screw head looks like, since I believe that's the same screw. It's possible that they intentionally made these of a black or red metal or something so they would look better with the overall color of the Famicom beam gun, but I don't know for sure. It does look like there's some corrosion on top of that regardless, so I'll see what I can do with them. Anyway, once you get that thing apart, the grip over here has these two wood-toned panels that just lift off. There's that last screw. There's another one on the back side, I believe, that should be loose now that the screws are out as well. Looks like that. So that's the first two plastic pieces that will need to get cleaned. Everything else, it just lifts off in two halves. Here's the top half. You can definitely see a good amount of dust in there that can probably be cleaned up. This is all one piece again, so nothing further to separate here. And here is the actual mechanism in it. This probably copper plate right here, that is what actually makes the connection between the power and the signal showing that the trigger is pulled, so that's what I was referring to when I said I cleaned a part of it with IPA and was able to get it working that way. It's held in here with this spring here for a little bit of extra pressure. All it is this copper plate with these dimple things to help apply pressure. There is also these two metal weights here that just add to the heft of the gun when you're actually using it. Try to pull those out and lay them aside. That one's kind of stuck in there, so I'll pull it out when I have everything else out of here. This is the lens part. You can definitely see some dust on that, so that really needs to be cleaned. That's just plastic as far as I can tell. But here is the actual circuit board. Even though this is that 15-pin connector that I mentioned, there are only 4 wires that are actually soldered in here. If I remember correctly, the red wire on the right is the voltage, the black wire on the left is the ground. Then the other 2 are the data pins that are specific to the light gun, and the way that the Famicom controller wiring works. You can probably see here that all you really have to do is bridge this big pad here over to this big pad here. That will make the connection to this green wire here, the second from the right. That is the trigger pin, which is pretty simple. The little plate there sits there, and when you pull the trigger, it rotates up into that area where it makes that connection. And you actually don't even need to pull the trigger all the way to make the click. As long as you pull it to about there, it's actually going to bridge that connection and be fine. So I guess you could do something like that if you wanted to speedrun a beam gun game, I don't know. But the other pin there, the white wire, goes up into this mess somewhere, and I haven't really figured out exactly how it works, but go ahead and pull this out so you can see the other side now. This up here is the actual light sensor, I believe. I'm assuming that eventually that wire goes up to here and goes through some of the circuitry in here. And that ends up telling you whether or not the light sensor is currently sensing anything. There's probably some filtering or something that goes on in this other circuitry that helps it compensate for the refresh rate of a CRT or something like that. I don't really know how it works, but as far as I know, there's no problems in there, so I don't really need to know how it works. There is a pretty intense strain relief here with several pegs that the wire widens around here to keep it from pulling out. I'll separate it here and try to get a little closer look at the PCB both sides, but there's some circuitry on there, but there's really not a lot to it. I'll probably maybe try to put a little IPA on the actual sensor in there, just in case. I think it's probably working fine right now regardless. So here you can see the actual trigger mechanism. I believe on the NES Zapper, if you open that up, the trigger mechanism is actually sealed inside a silver box type thing, so you don't have to disassemble that or be worried about accidentally breaking it when you just take it apart normally. Here you can actually see all the parts of the trigger mechanism, and it's not too complicated. There's this, might kind of blend in with the lighting here because it's brownish, but there's a spring right here that comes between the trigger part here and this peg here. And that just pulls that when the trigger is engaged. The spring is not actually allowed to snap back though, because there's this kind of curved piece here that the trigger is pushing against. So all that really happens here is that the trigger pushes this thing, which rotates out this whole lever assembly here. And then the click you hear when it actually finishes the pull is just the peg on the trigger here slipping off of that thing and letting it snap back into the place under tension from the spring. And then when you release the trigger, it just kind of nudges that out of the way and sits back into place there. I glossed over it earlier, but there is this... That wasn't supposed to happen. I'll gather those up in a minute. But there is this hammer mechanism here that the NES Zapper did not have, that I don't think it actually does anything useful, but it looks cool. But with that spring flown off to goddess knows where, I can take off the hammer and the trigger here. Those can be separated and cleaned later. And that's everything on this half except for this weight, if I can manage to pry that out. Okay, there it is. Okay, it looks like there was actually a little bit of adhesive keeping it in place there, so mostly dry there, but it was enough to make it not too easy to pull out, or not just shake out. Probably won't bother reapplying that, but I'll see how loose it is once I reassemble it. Just to point it out, here is that little curved piece I was pointing out that went flying. Again, just another plastic part that needs to be cleaned. So I am going to go root around on the floor for that spring, and I will probably just load all these into a big tub with soap and start cleaning them. Well, I did find that spring, no problem. It fell pretty much right under my feet, so I didn't have to search around for it too much. I also just kind of dripped a little IPA on some of these screws and tried just brushing them off with a fairly hard brush, and I think it did enough for my purposes. I think it was more dust than rust or anything. These over here are the ones that I cleaned off. These are some that are still unclean, so I think it did make enough of a difference that I'm not going to worry about it too much beyond that. This weight here from the barrel, I think I might try to do a little more intensive cleaning. I wiped this down with IPA2 and it didn't seem to get too much off, so I think that is actually non-trivial amounts of actual rust. What I might try to do for that, I think, is just try to soak it in vinegar somehow, or just brush some vinegar on it. I've seen that vinegar is kind of helpful for taking rust off of things, I believe, according to Google. And I have found that vinegar does seem to work pretty well for cleaning contacts on especially corroded cartridges, so I think it's worth trying. We'll see how it goes. I think you can kind of see here that some of this is also discoloration from adhesive. I guess this was probably glued into the barrel a little bit here too to keep it from rattling when it was manufactured. These weights stay pretty secure in the barrel as far as I can tell. When the thing is assembled, they do rattle a little bit though, and that's a little bit annoying, so I think it'll feel a little better quality if I can redo that adhesive with something, so I'll try to figure something out. So I've just got a big vat of water and dish soap here. I'm gonna swish these around a little bit, take a old toothbrush to them to help get some of the dirt from the crevices out, and probably just let it all soak overnight. Nothing too exciting here. I'm sure you can find many other videos of people doing the same thing. One thing I was going to point out that I noticed while I was gathering these up, this trigger part here does have what looks like a blob of grease along the shaft, so this may have been greased at some point. It's still kind of sticky, so it might still be doing something, I'm not sure, but it's probably pretty old regardless. We'll just clean it off with everything else. I don't know how tight it will be when I reassemble this thing if I don't grease it, but unless it gives me trouble, I'm not going to worry about it. I'll just take that off and drop it in with everything else. So I let the pieces here all soak overnight in that soapy water. This morning I took them out of the water, rinsed them off, toweled them off a little, and I'm just going to let them lay here out to dry for a little while longer, just to make sure we keep water well away from anything electrical when we reassemble this thing. And I think they generally look noticeably better. The main one is the trigger piece here had some gunk in it originally, and now that's pretty much gone as far as I can tell. And that crevice in there caught some stuff. I think some other stuff like the nameplates on the main body of the gun here had some dust in there that was a little hard to get out, so that helped some too. I think the lens should be clearer now too. Whatever good that does. This weight that I was looking at last night, I did soak it in vinegar for a while. I started with just 10 minutes, which is usually what I do on cartridge contacts, and that really didn't do very much, so I let it go for a couple of hours, which is what Google says you can do for things that are rusty. What I did is I set it in this little tray that I fashioned out of an old piece of PVC conduit stuff, and it definitely made a difference. It is now this metallic gray color instead of the black that it was before. There's still what looks like some rust spots in there, but I think a lot of it came up. I don't know if the black color that it had previously was actually corrosion or some kind of discoloration, or if it was actually a black paint or coating or something that was on here originally that the vinegar stripped off. I don't know, but since I don't want that necessarily happening to the screws, I am definitely not going to bother doing those. I think the kind of blackish finish on these after I just IPA them off a little bit is probably a better match, so I don't want to risk stripping that off. That's what the vinegar is doing. This one I think is fine as it is. Overall, this and the other weights still have some of that old adhesive on them. There's still some of that on the interior of the gun body a little bit too, so I might take some Goo Gone or whatever and try to get some of that to come loose too. We'll see if I can get anywhere with that. I think if I'm going to try to fasten these back down again, might be helpful to have that clean. But all of this is internal stuff, so I'm not going to worry about it too much if I can't get it looking completely pretty. What I'm probably going to do for purposes of the adhesive is just take a couple small pieces of command strip and just cut those down and hold it down with that. I think the pressure should make that hold it pretty firmly, since these things are already under a fair amount of pressure when they go back in. And I think command strip would be easier for someone else in the future to disassemble that if they have to, than some kind of more permanent adhesive like super glue or whatever. So for now, that's all I'm going to do. I'll just wait for these to dry and then pick up from there. Okay, as far as I can tell, this thing is pretty dry and clean, so this is where we get started putting it all back together, and hopefully I can remember how everything goes in. So I did try taking some Goo Gone to these sections here where the old adhesive was. It didn't seem to do very much. The stuff is pretty dried out. There's probably some way I could get it off if I scrubbed it more with some chemical, but since it's all internal bits, I'm not going to worry about it too much. Like I said, I am going to be using some little bits of command strip here to try to stick these weights back in place. Because these weights do rattle if you don't have them secured, so I think it'll be a little nicer feeling product if we do secure the weights down just a little bit somehow. And command strips do have a little bit of thickness to them, but I am hoping that the pressure from the casing will help compress it down so that doesn't affect things. This long weight in the barrel actually is sitting a little bit above the command strips, but they still seem to be gripping it at least a little bit. I'm just going to set this on here and test fit it. And it doesn't sound like there's too much rattling going on there, so I think that'll be okay for my purposes. So the first thing we need to slip on here is just put this bottom half of the grip thing on here. Screws are eventually going to need to grab onto that, just so I don't forget about it later. Then we need to reassemble this whole trigger assembly here. Trigger faces that way, I think. Rotates like that. For now, it doesn't feel like there's any resistance to that really, so I'm going to assume it doesn't terribly badly need any grease or lubricant. If it becomes a problem, one can always open this up and put some WD-40 or whatever in there, I guess. I don't know what the best lubricant for plastic is. And this rotating hammer piece goes up here somewhere. Then we have this little circular piece here. There's a peg on the hammer that sits on, and it just rests above the pivot where the hammer rotates there. Now, the trigger is supposed to rest kind of in the middle there, between where the curvy piece meets the edge of the part coming off the hammer. And let's see. We then have this spring. One end of it goes around the hook on the trigger here. And the other end goes around this hook sticking up on that round piece. I think. Like that. Perfect. Since I didn't get to show it off earlier because of how the spring flew off on me, I'm going to try and keep this in place. The way this action is intended to work is you pull back the hammer. The edge of the trigger, I guess, locks down underneath the lip of the hammer there. but apparently you shouldn't do that. So I will not do it any further. Okay, there we go. I'm going to leave it alone now. The PCB needs to sit on the pivot there. There's a lot of loopies on this strain relief down here. Let's see if I can get it back into place correctly. I believe it goes around. Okay, between those two, then around like that and straight down. Got it. Next, this piece, which I'm going to try not to smudge, and in fact I'm going to spray down with IPA a little bit again, just to make sure it didn't get any dust on it while I had it out. I guess I should do the same with the contacts on here. Just because this is the main electrical contact that actually makes the whole thing work. And it has a non-circular opening so that it has to sit in exactly the right spot. I think that's aligned properly. And there is this short spring that sits on top of there. Oh, and also important, we can't forget to put the lens back in here. I think it matters which way that thing goes. It doesn't really do too much light that I can tell, but... And then assuming I did everything right there, this should just sit on top of it and lock everything in place. Yep, that feels fine. And then we just set this grip piece on, and then it's just a matter of screwing everything down. Okay, both ends are secure, so everything should lock in place. Okay. All right, there we go. We have a reassembled beam gun here. For all our pew-pewing needs. Let's show the back of it again, real quick. All right, what I should now have is a clean, functioning Famicom beam gun. It still hasn't been tested, so I think it would be a good thing to demonstrate how I would go about testing this thing. I do not actually have a CRT TV, and probably never will, because I spent way too much time in the early 2000s carrying those things around. They are heavy, and I hate them. But the light gun technology really does not work on anything other than CRTs because of timing stuff and lag stuff and whatever. I'm sure you know all about that. So how exactly one goes about testing these things without a CRT is a little fiddly, but I think it's at least possible. So just to prove a point here, I'm going to start up a light gun enabled game here. And it is pretty easy to prove that the trigger works here. But we actually go into the game. We've got some ducks, and there is absolutely nothing I can do about them. One thing I've occasionally seen people claim is that you can point the thing at a light. There is a light up here that does nothing. And if I take a really bright LED flashlight and do that, still does nothing. Yeah, you laugh. You better laugh. One thing you might notice that looks like it's visible on my screen, but it's kind of subtle, is that it doesn't even show the white hitbox around the duck when it detects that light at the time you pull the trigger. So I think it's probably looking for the screen being black at the time you pull it and then white a frame later to detect a hit, or some kind of clever algorithm like that. So unfortunately, that means there is no trivial way you can cheat the game or test the game. So we will need other methods. Fortunately, I did find a forum thread somewhere that someone did make some simple test ROMs for the Zapper. They don't do anything terribly exciting visually, but the easy one is we can verify that when I pull the trigger, which pretty much happens right there, we can verify that it is actually detecting the trigger pull. It's making that buzzing sound whenever that happens. I have to actually restart the console when I run those test ROMs because they don't actually have any input handling from the controller, I don't think, so the flash card can't hook into that. But in any case, there is also one here for testing the light sensor. It's pretty much the same thing and just as visually exciting, but it can at least prove that if you shine a bright light into the gun here, it does detect the bright light here because it's not doing anything special other than just seeing if there is a value on the sensor, as far as I know. So if I have a flashing light like that, it will detect that change. So, anyway, I consider that sufficient to prove that this Famicom beam gun is indeed working and tested. And that's really all I had to say about it. Just hoped this event might be a useful video for someone out there who is more excited about beam guns than I am and actually wants to play games with them, with a CRT and everything. In any case, thank you for watching, and have a beautiful evening.